we've got two games to talk about since the Eagles came into town last Monday, right after we recorded the show. So we've got two games to talk about, and thankfully two wins to talk about, which is very exciting. And we'll look at what that means for this team going forward. So we'll start with that Eagles game. Last Monday, December 18th, versus the Philadelphia Eagles was a 20-17 victory. The Seahawks snap their losing streak. They continue to help the Eagles and their current skid that's continued into this last NFL Sunday with a 20-17 victory. Drew Lock starts this game. There was a lot of confusion whether or not Geno Smith would be able to play in this game. It was determined that they would go into warmups and see if he would be able to go, considering the groin injury that he had suffered in practice leading into this game. He was taking warmups. He was practicing before the game, but ultimately Pete Carroll decided they would rather have him healthy going forward than potentially re-aggravate anything, and they went with Drew Lock. This game, it was a tough one for the offense under Drew Lock and against a pretty solid Philadelphia Eagles defense. It was a 10-3 score at halftime with Seattle trailing, so you're within it. You're within one score. Seattle is able to make the necessary stops late, down by 4 points. Drew Lock is able to find DK Metcalf several times going down the field before ultimately finding Jackson Smith-Njigba up the sideline on an over-the-shoulder catch to give the Seahawks the lead, and ultimately Julian Love, with his second interception of the game, picks off Jalen Hurts in the dying moments to give Seattle a huge victory. So our offensive player of the game, I just mentioned him. I could have gone with a few different directions here. You know, you could have gone with JSN. We're catching the game-winning touchdown, but I instead went with DK Metcalf. He didn't have the biggest game per se. In total, his stat line was 5 receptions for 78 yards. He was big on the final drive, though, beating James Bradbury, Eagles corner, several times to get down the field, coming up big in that clutch situation to help bring Seattle down the field so that ultimately Drew Lock could get that pass, that game winner to Jackson Smith-Njigba. On the defensive side of the ball, Julian Love has stepped up big in Jamal Adams' absence. Talked about Geno Smith being out of this game. Jamal Adams was out of this game as he continues to deal with lingering effects to the surgery he had in the offseason. He was inactive for this game. He was also not at the stadium. Technically, as an inactive, he didn't have to be there, but that's an interesting note that a lot of the fan base has been aware of and been made aware of, and we'll talk about how that relates to the Titans game here in a minute. But Julian Love, you know, signed in the offseason from the Giants, has gotten some scrutiny, as has a good amount of the Seahawks defense, to be fair. But Julian Love in this game, 9 total tackles, 6 solo, 2 interceptions, which were big, and 2 pass deflections as well. As I mentioned, has been big in stepping up in relief as Jamal Adams has been injured. So that one was a big one. Going into this Titans game, though, Geno Smith back in the lineup. Some fans had thought, hey, why not Drew Lock again? We'll talk about that in a minute. But you go in against this Titans team that's not fighting for a playoff spot right now. They still have Derrick Henry. Will Levis, their emergent rookie quarterback, was not able to go, so Ryan Tannehill was in for this game. It was a tough game for Seattle, even though it was one that some fans thought should have been sort of a runaway. It was not. Seattle had to engineer another game-winning drive, beating the Titans by a score of 20-17, and with that comeback, the Seahawks became only the second team in NFL history, the first in 24 years, to have different players lead game-winning drives in back-to-back games, which is remarkable to think about, with Drew Lock and Geno Smith going in and doing that. After the game, Smith talked heavily about this team and how they practice the 2-minute drill often. It's obviously paying off. This one was tough. Seattle couldn't get too much going. Ultimately had, again, to another big drive at the end of the game to lead this one off. And then it was, on the offensive drive, I talked about against the Eagles, DK Metcalf was big, leading Seattle down the field. This time around, it was more spread out. There were a few different notable pass plays that helped Seattle get down the field, including a 3rd and 14 where Geno Smith found Jackson Smith-Njigba straight down the heart of the Tennessee defense. Ultimately, on the goal line, Seattle threw a somewhat of a fade route to Kobe Parkinson, the 6'7" tight end out of Stanford, to use that body, use that big boy football and catch that touchdown. On the defensive side of things, when Tennessee got the ball back, Tariq Woolen, who had been benched against the Eagles, has a big comeback game in this one, making a big tackle at the end of the game to keep the Tennessee receiver inbounds and have the clock run out to end the game. So on the offensive side of the ball, not a ton of big, per se, flashy, superstar type numbers on the offensive side of the ball. But Geno Smith, I mean, to be able to come back, lead the game-winning drive was big in the second half of this game. In total, 25 completions, 277 passing yards, and 2 touchdowns, including the game-winning drive, of course. I know there's been a lot of scrutiny about Geno, and I don't think that's fair. In the second half, completed 15 of his 20 passes for 158 yards and 2 touchdowns. On third down, 5 for 6, 5 conversions and a touchdown, was huge in the second half of this game. Not being able too much to get the run game going, and finally having both of his offensive tackles healthy. So we'll talk about that in a minute. On the defensive side of the ball, a guy that was lighting things up earlier in the season with a sack streak that he had, kind of been quiet as teams have adjusted and schemed to block him better. Second-year linebacker Boye Mafe has been big. Was big in this game, was big earlier in the season as he continued to rack up sacks. But in this one, 6 total tackles, 5 solo, 2 sacks, 2 tackles for loss, and 4 quarterback hits. So really getting after Ryan Tannehill in this one, including a sack on the last Tennessee drive of the game as well to help kind of put a damper on their drive. Inactives were relatively the same for the Eagles and the Titans game. The only difference was Frank Clark swapped out for Kenny McIntosh between the Eagles and then the Titans game. D'Estridge inactive. Devon Witherspoon has been inactive. So Seattle missing Devon Witherspoon. Obviously, that's a big inactive to have. Jamal Adams has been out. So there are a few topics to talk about here with the Seahawks, whether it be the quarterback situation, Jamal Adams. But before anything else, we'll look at these wins. These wins are big because with a Vikings loss on Sunday, the Seahawks move into the final wildcard spot in the NFC. So that's big, obviously, because, you're back in the playoff picture. You had that 4-game losing streak, that tough stretch of the 49ers, the Cowboys, the 49ers again, and then the Eagles. You only get 1 win out of it. But you could argue that those tough games against the NFC's best have made you a better team, per se. I'm not going to say that this Seahawks team is now sort of invincible, but they're battle tested, and that's what you need going into the playoffs. It's still a tough road. You still have 2 games to play. That's not guaranteed, but you control your own destiny. And we've talked about this on this show with different teams. The Mariners last season controlled their destiny to get to the playoffs. Ultimately, they failed. They had it in their hands and they failed. The year before, they had it in their destiny and they were able to punch that ticket to the postseason. So at the end of the day, no matter what sport it is, I would rather control my destiny than have to rely on other teams when it comes to the postseason. Next week, it's not going to be easy. You're playing a Steelers team that is without Kenny Pickett. They are going to start Mason Rudolph next week, but they're the same record as the Seahawks. They're fighting for their playoff lives as well. So it's 2 teams that want to get to the same place, and they have to go through each other to do so. So I like where this team is going. You have most of your offensive line healthy. You've got your tackles healthy, which is big. Your weapons are incredible at the wide receiver position. Kenneth Walker seems to be fully back, which is massive as well. On the offensive side of the ball, you use Kobe Parkinson, who on your depth chart is arguably your 3rd tight end, which was nice to see him get involved. They haven't really thrown a lot of red zone targets to the tight end since Jimmy Graham was here. And even then, when he was a Seahawk, they only did that in his last season. On the defensive side of the ball, it's tough. It's very tough. Without Devon Witherspoon, who is such a big, dynamic corner who can help in the run game, is a great cover guy as well. That's tough. You like to see Tariq Woolen, after being benched against the Eagles, have a big game against the Titans. The bench, John Wooden, the legendary John Wooden, said that the bench can be a coach's best friend. Help teach those lessons to some of these players. Dre'Mont Jones is he's had an interesting season, not the easiest, but with Uchenna Nwosu going out earlier in the year, he's moved from inside defensive line to out on the edge to help this pass rush. He had one of the sacks that Seattle had, 6 sacks against the Titans. I talked about Boye Mafe. Seattle leads the NFC in sacks. You think that would help them be a better defense? They're dealing with some things. Anyway, they've helped. Against the Eagles last week. Last week. Being able to kind of limit that offense. Jalen Hurts wasn't able to get a lot. He didn't look great in that game. He threw 2 picks. That running game as well. They've got a strong running game. They got one of the best offensive lines in the league. Seattle was able to help mitigate that, get their offense the ball back to lead to that Drew Lock game-winning drive. Same thing with this. I mean, you're playing Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry threw a touchdown against the Seahawks. They had to get creative. They had to get crafty late in the game. Seattle was able to make the stop to get their offense the ball back. So, it's been impressive to see both sides of the ball be relentless, be resilient as they move forward and try to figure some things out as this season goes on, as they battled some of the tougher teams in the NFC. With the quarterbacks, I know there were a lot of fans who were, pounding the table for Drew Lock. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. If you look at that Eagles game, most of his passing yards come on that game-winning drive. It doesn't make sense to say, oh, yeah, there's a quarterback controversy now. I get it. It was an excellent story. It was great for Drew Lock to come in. Everybody was playing Put On by Jeezy because of his video that went viral when he was with the Broncos. I get it. It was great. I had fun with it too. It doesn't make sense, though, to start him over Geno Smith, who can throw the ball better, who leads the offense better, and is just more experienced. I'm sorry. I understand the Drew Lock thing. It was a fun experience. He very well could get a contract somewhere else next year. I get that. But I just think Geno Smith makes more sense as your quarterback right now. I'm not saying he's your future quarterback. That's a different discussion that we need to have in the offseason, but he will do for right now. He fits the bill for what you're doing in this current moment. End of discussion. There shouldn't be anything more than that. The Jamal Adams situation, that's interesting. Not being in the stadium for the Eagles game that Pete Carroll was aware of. And there hasn't been anybody that's necessarily disputed that. Adams himself hasn't disputed that because he hasn't been around. And then against the Titans, didn't travel to Nashville. I understand, if you're dealing with an injury and you want to rehab it, that's fine. But, it says something, at least to me, that he wasn't present at either game. Devon Witherspoon has been inactive for both of these games. He was very presently at the Eagles game he's been very present about hyping his teammates up, whether it was week 1 when he didn't play. There's been a video when Bobby Wagner comes out to introductions. He's losing his mind about how excited he is to see Bobby Wagner come out. Against the Eagles, there's sideline video of him hyping up fellow first-round pick Jackson Smith-Njigba. It's there's a difference here, and I get it. There are different situations per se. Jamal Adams has dealt with a lot of injuries throughout the course of his career and has had a relatively tough tenure here in Seattle. Devon Witherspoon's brand new here in a Seahawks uniform. But, the effort is something that's visible and apparent to me, and that's why that sticks out. So the Jamal Adams situation is something certainly to be discussed going forward, especially with the play of Julian Love, who had another solid game against the Titans after his wife, congratulations, by the way, just had their child a few days before, and he had to come to Tennessee separately. He had a big game as well. So, again, the effort stands out to me. If it's a parent, the efforts being made is my point. So that's where we are with that. The Seahawks sit at 8-7 right now, which is still good for third in the NFC West because the Rams keep winning, which is frustrating. And why the Seahawks aren't the 6th seed in the NFC. The Rams, because they swept the Seahawks this season, have the tiebreaker. So going forward, though, you are still in the playoff spot. And as I mentioned, you control your own destiny. So that starts 2 games left. That starts on Sunday, December 31st against the Pittsburgh Steelers with a 1:05 p.m. Pacific time kickoff. That game will be on Fox. It's not going to be an easy one. Again, the Steelers under Mike Tomlin have incredible consistency. I'm not saying they're the best team in the AFC, but they've been incredibly consistent. They're a hard-nosed football team. TJ Watt's going to play some factor in this game as well. And they're fighting for their playoff lives as well. They have the same record as the Seahawks. It's not going to be some sort of pushover that's going to be easy for Seattle in this one. So